and they more effectively can solve problems. And that's been focused on in a lot of different curriculums. But now we also know that there's this need to add that health system science piece, that third pillar, and focus on care delivery. And this is where a lot of the social determinants of health pieces that we're going to talk about today will come in. And so we had some opportunity because our fourth year medical students come off of their clerkships every Friday afternoon to do case-based learning. It used to be called IQ Plus, and it was very kind of clinically derived. And so now we had the opportunity to sort of change that around and think about ways that we could potentially improve or optimize that learning experience. So our broad goal in doing this was, one, improving clinical reasoning broadly. We want to teach people how to think, not just to be able to regurgitate things, but to think through problems and also give them some strategies for when everything doesn't fit in the puzzle the way they think that it's supposed to. And then also this idea of developing clinicians that provide high value care in the sense of not just knowing the medicine, but understanding how to apply that to each individual person that they might see and how that might be really useful. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. This was our new curricula, the Science and Art of Medicine Integrated, or what I'll call SAMI. That was the name of the program that we started and how the students refer to it now as well. So the goals we had kind of coming into this program, like I mentioned, more specifically though, are wanting to improve clinical reasoning. We want to integrate those three pillars of medicine, strengthen history and physical exam skills. What we always hear from students is they want more feedback, they want more opportunities to be observed. So we'll talk a little bit about how we built that in as well. We wanted to enhance humanism, so reflection, discussion, focus on communications, and some of those tougher or quote softer skills that benefit students in the long run. And then also fostering engagement with kind of a patient's personal and systemic context. So thinking about not just how they present in the room where they see them, but kind of the big picture of how they live their lives and how that might impact their health outcomes. So our design team was fairly sizable, and the planning and ongoing administration of this curriculum required really a collaborative team effort. So in this list, we have clinicians, basic science educators, HSS and communication experts, bioethicists, clerkship directors, and current medical students. So we really tried to get a wide breadth of people to make sure that we were looking at all the different perspectives we needed to make this successful. So we sort of started brainstorming and working on this curriculum back in 2018. It finally launched in the summer of 2019. As you can imagine, everyone's probably aware, COVID hit in the middle, so that we had some changes there, but we were able to still maintain the curriculum during that time. And so all of our medical students, fourth year medical students, participate during their core clerkships. And then we did take this through the IRB so that we could disseminate this data, as we think this will be hopefully something that's helpful to others too, as they're considering further curricular innovations. So the curriculum itself, it runs parallel with the clerkship years. So as I mentioned, on 3 Fridays of the month in the afternoons, all of the students come back to campus. They're in groups of 5 to 9. They were purposely designed to be on different clerkship schedules. So we have people who are in different specialties working together. So if it's a neuro case and you're on neuro, it's your week to shine. If you're on OB and you haven't thought about neuro yet, you might sit back and look and see what your team members come up with. But we wanted to make sure that we had different perspectives coming into each group as opposed to everybody who's on the same rotation at the same time. We have consistent groups over the course of the year, as well as consistent facilitators as much as possible. So for our facilitators, we have clinicians, residents, fellows, attendings, PAs, and then we also have some retired clinicians that come in to help facilitate the groups. And then we have a pretty rigorous schedule each week that is the same so that everybody knows what they're doing each time. The topics will change a little bit, but the actual schedule itself stays the same. Like I said, it's highly structured and we're doing everything in real time. So this was very purposeful to try and mimic the experience they have on their clerkships and once they get out into the hospitals. We went back and forth for a long time and decided ultimately not to give them any prep work to do because we recognized that, let's be honest, not everyone would do it. And also just the idea that they're going to walk into this just like they would walk into a brand new room with a patient and need to figure out how that was going to work for them. There's no post-session work. Everything is contained in the hours that they're with us. And it is not graded. It's a meets, does not meet expectations. We really just want people to engage and be thoughtful as opposed to working for a specific grade or anything of that nature. So the first step, as we were thinking about our SAMI curriculum, would be if we want our students to work through an undifferentiated case, what disease states or symptom focus do we want to have? What do they need to know about? And so we wanted to make sure that we address things that are commonly seen, look for horses, not zebras, but also make sure that we address any conditions that the clerkship directors identified that they felt like the students weren't as good at managing. So either they didn't know enough about it, they didn't know how to do the physical exam, they had questions on how to take a history. So we tried to incorporate those pieces into the cases that we designed. We also had to fight back and forth about not making it too easy, not making it too hard, and kind of finding that sweet spot for the level that our students were at. So when we think of the undifferentiated symptoms, we give them sort of this, quote, vague symptom. And so some examples of things that we use are things like fatigue, shortness of breath, quote, change in behavior. Also things like confused or back pain, things that could be present in nearly any office or any medical setting, but that might have a fairly wide differential for what you're considering and working through in your head when somebody presents in that way. So I can give you an example of some of the topics or disease states we ultimately landed on. We have things like endocarditis, PE in pregnancy. You're all good readers, you can see those. We also have things like hepatocellular carcinoma, AML, COVID, eating disorder, abnormal uterine bleeding. There were all a whole host of different things that we were able to work in. And each week is different. So there's no bearing on previous weeks in terms of trying to kind of figure out what's going on. So the patients that we assign have a variety of ages, everything from a neonate to a geriatric patient. And then to try and further mirror that clerkship experience, we varied the presentation locations as well. So sometimes it might be an outpatient clinic, sometimes it might be an emergency room or an urgent care. The patient sex was only specified when necessary to the disease. So for example, preeclampsia or other pregnancy-related disorders. But that was largely done to facilitate recruiting standardized patients, because if we didn't have to make a specific, the less specific we had to make it, the better chance we had for recruiting patients, excuse me. And then we also purposefully incorporated the World Health Organization's standard, social determinants of health, and then the domains of health symptom science into each case. So that was very purposefully done, and something we realized historically when we were looking at clinical reasoning and thinking about how to teach that hadn't necessarily been incorporated. So these are just some of the cross-cutting domains of the health system sciences. These were reviewed and specifically acknowledged formally during the sessions, just as things that are important parts of learning especially at the clerkship stage. And then, there we go. These are just some examples of some of the social determinants of health that we incorporated. This is part of the World Health Organization's list. We also used some of those from the CDC. So things that you would expect, everything from food insecurity to income, social protection, discrimination, employment status, et cetera. There's a much longer list, and given that we had nearly 20 cases, we tried to incorporate a different social determinant of health into each case, and wanted to do it in a way that was realistic and also helpful in terms of thinking about care delivery and what some of those barriers might be. So this is one of those things where it was very purposefully done. So we talked a lot about sort of, as we mentioned, the title of SAMI is the science of and the art of medicine. So the science piece was the, figuring out the diagnosis, figuring out the workup, doing those pieces. But then we also wanted to look at what we call the art of medicine. And this is something that I think as teachers, as clinicians, and those kinds of things, we recognize the importance of to some extent, but I find that sometimes with learners, they don't yet know what they don't know. So some of these things I felt like were really important, whether they knew they needed it or not. But then there was also feedback that we got that actually mirrored that, which I was happy to see. And the students really validated the value of reflection, storytelling, the opportunity to debrief. They see all kinds of things on their clerkships without any place to really process some of that information. They also identified specific clinical skills, which they felt like they needed more exposure to, practical skills like sign out, discharge planning, and then also kind of those communication skills that they felt like were harder than they thought they were going to be. So things like delivering bad news, leading care conferences, things of that nature. And so we try and incorporate that in as well. So what does that actually look like? That's when we start diving into kind of the schedule of what our Friday afternoons look like. So they start at 1 o'clock, they go until 4:30, and this is the exact same schedule they have each week. Now, obviously, the content in these, depending on the disease state, depending on the activities, et cetera, differs a little bit, but these are the specific categories that they will be addressing each time. Okay, so when they go into the session, there are a few different roles for students that they rotate through within their groups. So you have the timekeeper, who helps everybody stay on track, because as you notice, that was a pretty tight schedule. So making sure that people are where they need to be, when they need to be, and that they're transitioning between activities. They fill out some paperwork related to that. You have the scribe, who's actually going to take notes throughout. We'll talk a little bit about that role. So they're filling out paperwork, they're filling out information about the encounters with patients, with what's going on with their differential, kind of as they work through the case, they're keeping notes. You also have the patient context leader, which is going to fill out our context of illness tool. Just keep that in the back of your minds, because we'll talk about that in a second. But they're really focused on thinking about that individual patient and how they're going to help the team contextualize that particular individual. And then you have the leader. So this is a person who is going to do the standardized patient encounter. So we have about 20 teams. 10 of them can do the encounter each week. So if you're the leader who gets to do the encounter, you go in and you see the patient. If you're the person who is not on that encounter list, you're actually going to be the observer. So they will observe the interaction as it's happening, and they will provide information to the standardized patient and to the student who's doing the encounter as they go. We'll talk a little more about that too. But they're also going to guide the group and then submit all the paperwork as well at the end. So the materials that the students and the facilitators get each week include learning objectives, the case, all the templates and the paperwork, etc. And then the facilitators will get a far more completed information guide. So it has more information about the case. All the documents are completed. There's discussion questions, things to help with facilitation, et cetera. So they get a really specialized packet. And then all the students will get the basic case information, the templates, and then the things we're asking of them, the activities for that week. So they each get that each week. And then we go into sort of the schedule of what the day-to-day looks like. So this will mirror the schedule we saw before with all of the times on it. So we start with check-in. This is a 15-minute unstructured check-in. So this has an opportunity for the group to do some storytelling, debriefing, and discussing career planning. The students for the first 10 minutes are unfacilitated to allow for a little more candor and privacy, and then their facilitator joins them at the end to help kind of tie up any loose ends there. Then the group receives a one-line patient description. So this has the age, the vague chief complaint, where the patient's being seen, and the vital signs. With that little bit of information, the group's going to work together to create sort of their initial differential diagnosis. And so then they're also going to think about, okay, if I'm walking into a room with a patient that has this vague complaint, what are some things that are, quote, must for this chief complaint? So if there's shortness of breath, what kind of lung exam do I need to do? What kind of questions do I need to ask? Are there other physical exam strategies that I need to address? Are there other questions that I should ask? And as the group's going through this, your facilitator is going to essentially just keep asking why. Why are you thinking this? Why are you doing this? And have them think out loud about what they're going to do and why they're going to do it. The scribe at this point is taking notes of the strategy, and then during the patient encounter, and then updating this as they go. So then the case is going to be revealed through a standardized patient encounter. So the leader walks over to our simulation center where they will interact with a simulated patient that's a hired actor. And they're going to do their interview and exam, and that's going to be live streamed back to the group. So everyone gets to watch it, though they're the only person in the room. And how that will work is the observer who is in the room watching all of this has a checklist. So say it's for a cardiac condition. There might be 7 boxes that you should be doing during a cardiac exam. Once they do at least 5 or 6 of those, there's a specific number. The observer will hand a piece of paper to the leader who is doing the encounter that gives them data, and it will give all the information from the cardiac exam that they read out loud to the group. And so each group only gets the data that their leader earned during the interaction. So once they do the encounter, they come back to their group because it's only a couple-minute walk around. And the student who performed the patient encounter will will perform a quick patient presentation to the group. This is intentional to make them kind of practice that presentation on the fly. The group will provide some feedback about the interactions that happened, what they thought they were missing, what went well, and the scribe will continue to take notes as they're going through all of these components. There will not be feedback provided from the facilitator of the group to that learner yet, because that will be coming later. So as everyone's talking about this particular patient, we start to think about sort of the who or the world of this patient. Because we recognize when we miss those details, that's often where the healthcare delivery part fails. Even if you know everything about the science and you understand exactly what needs to happen, making it happen can be a very different thing. And so this is where we developed the context of illness tool. So this is designed to help students kind of more fully explore who their patient is and describe the context in which the illness occurs. So from individual to population and health systems. They're going to consider every patient detail, and then they're going to place it into different domains on this tool. So you have the biological domain, which includes details, both positive and negative, that might influence the patient's health. So things like physical attributes, pre-existing conditions, genetic influence, etc. We have the psychosocial domain, psycho-emotional domain, that includes details about psychological and emotional state and their approach and beliefs about health, which I think can often be really important. Then we have the social domain, which includes, again, both positively and negatively, the patient's ability to care for themselves and their family. So this might include things about relationships, work environments, their physical environment where they're living, a whole host of different things like that. And then we've got the system societal domain, which includes details that impact kind of the patient's interaction with their world. So are they insured? Are they a victim of unfair housing practices? Are they in a food desert? And so we want the students to really consider unknown details that are critical to fully appreciating the context and their interactions with the broader system. So this is an example of a context of illness tool for someone that presented with essentially they find out will be sleep apnea. And so what we have the students do is on the top half of each circle, they put the things they learned in watching the evaluation of the patient or the assessment of the patient. In the bottom section, it's things that we would like to know, right? So for instance, we have kind of your basic demographics in that top of the first biological circle. So it's things like, pre-diabetes, 43 years old, uses a lot of caffeine, etc. Some questions are, what's the retake blood pressure? Are they willing to treat hypertension? Are they eating high salt foods, etc.? So just kind of making them think about all the different pieces that might be impacting those specifics. And yes, because this is a patient that presented with fatigue due to, as yet, undiagnosed obstructive sleep apnea. So we'll work a little bit through this case. And honestly, I think you could spend some time getting stuck in where things belong. We're less worried about that. It's more that they're getting the things on the paper and thinking about these different factors. It's just sometimes I think the structure of the different domains makes it a little bit easier to capture that. So once they fill out that tool, we give them the opportunity to ask 3 more questions. We wanted to make this as lifelike as possible. So it's sort of that idea of you do your initial assessment, you walk out of the room, you think, oh, there's a couple things I still need to go, and you can go back into the room. You don't have time to do another full assessment, but you can pop in a couple questions if you need to. So these could be about physical exam findings, they could be about history, they could be about, just the patient's story broadly. The facilitator, like I mentioned, has a guide that has a lot more information about the patient. If they can answer those questions, they will. If they don't, it's unfortunately somewhat lifelike in that they will just say, I don't know. Unfortunately for the students, that counts as a question, but they get 3 opportunities to ask more questions. So then, using the data they have, the students start to create an in-depth differential diagnosis. So again, the facilitators are really pushing the why are you thinking this? Why are you saying that? Why are you going in that direction? And so we want them to think out loud and learn from each other's clinical reasoning. And this also helps the facilitators understand if there's gaps in the reasoning. And it ultimately concludes with the students selecting the top 3 diseases from their list. Now, this could be, they might pick the most likely disease, they might pick the most lethal disease, but they're going to pick 3 of those diseases, 2 or 3, depending on the size of the group, to work up. Okay. If the students are wrong, though, we do not tell them at this point. We go ahead and let them work up the incorrect differential. We initially had started by telling them if they were wrong, and they actually said, don't do that. Let us work through it and figure it out, and then if we're wrong down the road, you can let us know. So they start working up these different components. We have them do that with 2 of the strategies that are outlined. This is where I mentioned we've worked closely with Aquifer Sciences. So we have the integrated illness script and then the mechanism of disease map. So the integrated illness script kind of defines the condition, epidemiology, the underlying pathophysiologic insult, and the causal and conceptual explanations of some of these key features for a prototypical presentation of the disease. So sort of what's happening in the science. What we're really focusing on here is the epidemiology. Then the mechanism of disease map is going to illustrate the more holistic interrelationships of these underlying core concepts and the causal explanations for each clinical feature, starting with that underlying insult. So I'll show you an example of that because that's just a lot of words. But essentially, we want them to really think about the epidemiology, and then we're going to have them design these mechanism of disease maps to make sure they really understand how all of these pieces fit together. So this is a template of the illness script that I mentioned, the integrated illness script. So this really kind of dives into some of the basic science pieces, which isn't the focus of this talk, but something we still thought was important. Because what we recognize is we teach sort of the systems 1 versus systems 2 thinking. So the pattern recognition versus that, you have to kind of slow down and reason through things. And what we want people to be able to do is when they really get themselves into a clinical pickle, that they can fall back on the basic science to help them get unstuck. And so this is where we really have them dive into the epidemiology of each of the conditions that they picked. And again, this is going to be a real focus on the prototypical presentations. This is based on signs and symptoms. We don't give them labs. They don't have imaging at this point. We just want them to recognize that there's so much you can do with a history and physical to help sort of figure out these components. And then we'll have them work together on what we call this mechanism of disease map. So it looks a little complicated, but this is following up on that same case of someone who has obstructive sleep apnea. So they picked the right condition, and now we're asking them to highlight the key clinical features, so things like storing morning headaches, etc., and then kind of work their way through to figure out how and why all of that's happening. So again, this is sort of thinking about the basic science mechanistic pathways and how those relate to the prototypical clinical features. We really push them to have sufficient detail here and make them dive in. So they have a fair amount of time to work on this, and they're welcome to look things up if they need to. They may not know the basics of all of these pieces, so we want them to have the time to be able to really tear that apart. Then it gets more complicated, but not really once you look at it. So once they're really looking through those completed mechanism of disease maps, we next want them to answer the question, what's the most likely diagnosis? So in their groups, they probably have 2 to 3 of these mechanism of disease maps because they've looked at 3 different conditions. Using these, we want them to really go through and figure out which of the 3 do they think is the causal or the true diagnosis for this patient. That's when the facilitator is going to tell them if they're right. So we reveal the diagnosis and then guide the group in revisiting their clinical reasoning if they were incorrect. So groups that were incorrect, we will actually provide them with a correct mechanism of disease map so they can peruse that. And those that constructed their own often will just work off of that. Then we're going to ask them to identify and justify the workup and treatment of this prototypical disease that they've identified. So you'll see here in red, you've got the squares and circles of the workup and treatment, and then the places with the red lines where there's impact of treatment. And this kind of also helps figure out where and why interventions help for certain conditions and where you might get the most bang for your buck, thinking about how you might work something specific up or what treatment you might start with. And there's also time here, if they don't know the answers to this, they have time to look this up, to ask questions, and kind of work together to make the best version of this that they can. Okay. So that was all, as I mentioned, for a very prototypical patient. That is your textbook definition of sleep apnea or whatever the condition is. Now, what we're going to do is ask them to come back to that specific patient. So what we're going to do is, and I would argue that this is when the fun starts. So what we're going to do is give them a completed context of illness tool with more information on it than they had initially. And then we're going to focus on how they're going to help that patient succeed with a specific component of that treatment. So this is just sort of the broad HSS structure and things that we're thinking about. But then we kind of come into the care delivery component of this. And we're taking it from transitioning just of understanding the diagnosis and what you should do to treat it, but also thinking about how to actually deliver it. And that's where I mentioned we're going to start with these targeted interventions. So when we give them this new context of illness tool, it's going to have more information about the patient. And this is sort of that same reality that there's more to know about a patient than you can be learned in that first 15-minute encounter. And this is as they're kind of getting information over time. And so the students are going to use this tool to outline the specific ways in which they're going to help the patient succeed in one aspect of the treatment. Now, when we ask them to dig into one aspect of treatment, we're going to give them a targeted intervention each week. So for example, in sleep apnea, it was weight loss. We recognize that picking one thing isn't going to solve all the problems, but it allows them to sort of focus and think about barriers and strengths and all the things that come with patient care. Because of course, we have a host of different targeted interventions for a host of different conditions. So we do things from sleep hygiene to long-term antibiotics, medication adherence, restoring trust, utilizing SDM, substance abuse, all different kinds of things that might impact people's care delivery. Oops, sorry about that. So this is an example of that completed context of illness that has the targeted intervention. And when I say completed, I just mean that it has more information on it. And so what we ask the students to do is, you'll see in blue, they've highlighted potential barriers, and purple, highlighted potential supports. So then we ask them to pick one potential support and expand on how you can leverage it, and then choose one potential barrier and outline ways to overcome it or help kind of start working in the correct direction. And that's what you'll see in these boxes above and below weight loss is the supports and then barriers. And then we really talk through it with the group in terms of how do you work with this patient? How do you talk about this with your patients? Because sometimes I think it conceptually makes sense, but thinking about what kind of words you might actually use. And the students gave us feedback, that initially this was hard. They weren't sure what the interventions were. So we built more into the facilitator guides so they can help sort of lead them and also give them strategies and places where they can look things up if they need to. So then each session concludes with what we call our case conclusion. Not all that clever, but and really where I think we dive into this art of medicine as well. So this activity differs per case, but it's based on whatever's happened during the case. So it might be a reflection piece. So we do reflective writing, discussion, basic science. So it might be a very specific epidemiologic piece, advanced communication skills, like I mentioned, like giving very bad news or how you have different kinds of discussions or do a sexual history or anything like that. There's bioethics cases, and there's also some clinical skills. And in the case of the sleep apnea, as we've been talking about, it was on motivational interviewing, helping people move towards weight loss. Other examples of things that fall in those case conclusions are things like, we call it, quote, bad decisions, meaning a reflection on when patients are making choices that you don't agree with. How are you navigating that? How are you processing that? What are you doing with that information? Shared decision-making, a reflection on bias and healthcare delays, difficult conversations, interpersonal violence, a lot of different things that might be impacting patients in their care and giving people the opportunity to explore some of that related to each of the cases. Then we go on to our checkout. So each of the sessions close with sort of a semi-structured checkout. The facilitators are provided with probing questions, and those kind of prompt the students to reflect on their individual contributions and then how the group is working together. They're encouraged to comment on strengths, areas of improvement, and on group dynamics. And then also engaged in sort of a group-based quality improvement process. Since they're working with the same people over time, it gives them the opportunity to potentially sort of tweak things as they go, as they see fit. Then once they're done with the session, all of the students are provided with take-home materials. I really like to think that they look at them. I hope so. They're provided with the learning objectives, a list of case resources. Each of the case authors provided the students a one-page quick guide to diagnosis and management of that condition. And then there's a summary of the workup and treatment discussed during the session. And then they get worked examples of all the materials so they can see the mechanism of disease map, they can see the integrated illness script, et cetera. They have those pieces to look at if they're interested. So as they go through the process, since we're able to do so much online now, which is great, we're able to do electronic submissions of some of these pieces. So like I said, we have the opportunity to stream the sessions to each group, and then they can kind of create living documents as they go through the session that we are then able to submit and look at once they send them in. So they can upload a document, they can take a screenshot because there's whiteboards in every room. If they'd rather write it out and take a picture, they can send that in. Most people tend to use the Google Docs, I think. And then, so we want to look at what diseases were they looking at. We want all of their mechanism of disease maps, thinking about their care delivery, see what people are picking and what they recognize. And it's one of those things that, despite it being a fair amount of work, I'll be honest, for the folks who are involved in that piece, we do look at all of the submitted materials because nobody does homework that nobody's going to check. So we look at all of that, and then we're able to give feedback on the mechanism of disease maps as well. So the detail, the accuracy, pieces they might be missing. So all of that is submitted at the end of the session. And then, like I mentioned, they get the after session materials, which I kind of worked through before in terms of they get copies of everything so they can go through the exemplars of what that should look like. The other thing that we have added in, as I mentioned before, is that students really mentioned that they need more feedback, they like to be watched, etc. So at the end of each session, any of the leaders who did the patient encounters, they have a one-on-one feedback session for that last chunk of time with the facilitator from their group. So they'll sit down, they'll rewatch the whole video, and they'll go through it one-on-one to talk about what went well, where are their growth edges, and are there things they missed or things they might do differently, or even just, the facilitators or clinicians may have ideas of ways that they have worked around those problems or ways they might ask questions or those kinds of things that the students have found really valuable. So when we think about sort of what we're hoping this curriculum does is kind of using all of these components to really think about effective care delivery and doing patient-centered care. As we recognize that, you can tell someone to take a medicine until you're blue in the face, but if they have 15 barriers to why they're not going to do it, it's not going to change those patient outcomes. And so we really want to try and look at the big picture and come at this patient care from all three different angles to make sure that we're being the most thorough and the most accurate and the most effective in that patient care delivery. So obviously there are some challenges. It's a pretty big program to run. And so we, had to recruit facilitators, which can be tricky because it's a chunk of time and on a Friday afternoon, no less. But we were able to get sufficient clinicians by utilizing residents, fellows, PAs, as I mentioned, and then we had retired and active faculty. So we always have a list of folks who can jump in if somebody can't make it. But we find, especially with the residents and fellows, there's a lot of folks who are interested in teaching and being involved in this, that this gave us a way to give them a specific chunk of something they could do that was very structured, but also didn't require more time. So they knew what was fitting into their schedule. So that was helpful. We're very thankful to have the Sim Center resources that we do in order to be able to do that. And we certainly needed significant administrative support to both create and implement this weekly program. We think about success also requiring sort of the open attitude of the students to engage in a curriculum that really pushes them kind of beyond what is traditionally viewed as the goal of clerkship. But they've jumped in pretty well. And I think our biggest thing is always just finding the time for the folks on the curricular design committee, the folks who are facilitating, and for the students. And so we've tried to sort of, I don't want to say cram as much into, but really focus that time that we have with them to try and make it the best that we can and get the most bang for our buck. So we get feedback both from the students who give us feedback about facilitation and the curriculum, and then feedback from the facilitators because they provide programmatic feedback. And we have made some adjustments over time. So, that schedule you saw initially has been tweaked over time where we realized people needed more time here, less time there. They didn't have enough time to get their questions together here. So they were able to sort of work through those different pieces and get the timing better. We'll also have been open to thinking about what gets submitted. Where are they spending their time? What are they working the most on to just do it in bullet points versus really write out and be complex about? So we just do the epidemiology of the integrated illness script versus we want them to give us a really complete mechanism of disease map. We also are always tweaking the clinical details of any case. So if we notice something's missing or we get feedback that we really needed this piece of data or we need this component flushed out a little bit, we can do those things and work with our case authors on that. Our targeted interventions, as I mentioned, we realized that both the facilitators and the students needed more kind of breadth and depth of knowledge. So we're able to provide some of that to the facilitators. So they're able to lead and kind of help guide the students in the way they need to and where they can look for that information to be successful. And then our case conclusions, we have tweaked over time with feedback from the students. When we realized that some of the things like the reflections and the debriefing and those kinds of things were important to them, we were able to build more of that in. In good news, we recognize that no matter what we do, some of our students are going to love it and some of our students are going to hate it. So we have to keep that sort of in mind as we go through this. But, over half the students felt like this was good or excellent in supporting their education. Over 75% agreed or strongly agreed that this supported clinical reasoning. And this one I think is probably the most pressing to me, is that 68% of the students indicated that the final care delivery process helps them consider the complex nature of treating patients. And I think that's a really important piece, because they are just starting to get their feet wet in the idea of clerkship and seeing the complexities of patients and how classroom medicine and hospital medicine may differ. And so I think this has been a well-timed and useful exercise for them. So broadly, the results of this most recent offering of the course really suggest that students are both positively engaged and find value in participating in this. And right now, we have not yet included an estimate of statistical power or validation of the student feedback tool, as this has not been a formal research study, but we are certainly thinking about ways to consider more formal survey approaches in the future. This is sort of some of our pilot data of the first couple of years. So we're hopeful that we've successfully designed an approach to model this optimal decision-making and look at it kind of across the spectrum. So from diagnosis all the way to targeted treatment, utilizing that integration of those 3 pillars of medical education. We feel like we've been able to integrate that basic science, the HSS, and the clinical medicine. And we're hoping that we're giving clinicians the ability to switch from that sort of pattern recognition to truly integrated thinking. And hopefully that makes better clinical decisions down the road, and then also helps them with that care delivery component. Because we're really hopeful that these are the clinicians that are going to be the ones that are transforming the healthcare system through this delivery of higher value care. And like I mentioned, the students have been engaged and done well with it so far. As I mentioned, we're limited in the ability to measure the impact the course participation has on clinical reasoning. So we're talking about developing sort of an integrative and standardized patient-based assessment as an OSCE or an objective structured clinical examination, because we'd love to see how these things are impacting over time, and are pretty sure that integrating these 3 pieces together will be helpful. So we're always kind of tweaking assessment and adjusting the current cases as we need to. Like I said, trying to assess the clinical decision-making more formally, getting these more formal feedback pieces, and then developing new cases. So for instance, in the middle of COVID, we had a COVID case written that really integrated the complexities of what COVID looked like in society at the time it was happening. And then, as I mentioned, continuing programmatic evaluation for both the students and the facilitators. So I want to give some special shout outs to the Aquifers Science Initiative. That's who we worked with on some of those tools, which has been really helpful. Doctors Wilson Delfos and Miller, who are our fearless leaders, and the rest of our design team, which I highlighted, which is a great group of humans to work with. Our 4th-year medical students for just jumping in and giving it a try, which I really appreciated. And then also our facilitators, who spend time out of the goodness of their hearts because they recognize that this is something important and are invested in training. And so we couldn't do it without them. So we have a few minutes left. I wanted to make sure we had some time for questions. I have some references at the end if anybody's interested.
Thank you so much. If I can also, excuse me, I can also unmute everyone, and we can just ask questions.
Sure, that'd be great.
You guys can unmute yourselves and feel free to ask questions.
Stop sharing for now. I know it's a small audience, so no pressure, but.
Hi there, I am Melissa Powelzak. I'm from the Zucker School of Medicine in New York. Thank you so much for such a great presentation and for describing what sounds like such an outstanding program. I have 2 questions really. Sure. The first relates to the composition of the student groups.
Sure.
Are they students that are sort of traveling together in the clerkships throughout the year, or are they a mix? And therefore, are some students getting cases related to clerkships that they haven't done yet? And I'm wondering if so, how that goes. And then my second question is whether you think this would be transferable to the facilitators, possibly playing the patients instead of the SPs. While not ideal, definitely less resource intensive. And I was wondering if you feel like that might be able to work.
Yeah, so let me start with your first question. And so the groups are actually designed so that they are not traveling together in cohorts. So we might have one person from each different potential rotation in one group. So some of them may not have had all of that information for each case, but someone in their group has. So one, we think it gives everybody sort of a little bit of chance to shine and kind of highlight the things they've been doing that week or that month. But also pushes them to think about conditions they may not know as much about and how they might be able to research or look into those things that they need. So they are a varied group there. As for the SPs, that's a really interesting question. I don't know that we had considered it that way, and I'm not sure our facilitators consider themselves great actors, but I certainly think there could be some utility in thinking about that for some place that doesn't have as much access to something like a sim center. I've also wondered, could you use like even third-year medical students or other people who are involved that might be able to do that without having a full simulation center set up?
Got it. Thank you. That's very helpful. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Happy to. Yeah, it's usually the number of people that can be tricky depending on how big the class size is. And this work actually will be coming out shortly in the Journal of Medical Education and Curricular Development. It's in press right now, so keep your eyes peeled for that because it will have many of the same figures and those kinds of stuff that I brought up, if that would be helpful.
If you, once that's, like, there's a link for it, I'm happy to share it too with everyone. So feel free to send it along.
Yes, I don't have it yet, but as soon as I do, I can send it over.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I'm gonna drop the link to the evaluation in the chat, but feel free if anyone else has additional questions. And if there's no additional questions, we can wrap up. And like I said, the video will be posted, or the recording of the session will be posted within the next week, and I will email it and put it on our website.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate you guys coming to listen to me talk.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Absolutely. My pleasure. It's fun to talk about.
Well, thank you, everyone. And we will wrap up.
Thanks so much. I hope you all have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.